The orange glow of re-entry faded from the viewport as Commander Han Taz's transport ship approached Station Nova 12. She pressed her face against the transparent barrier, taking in the massive structure that would be her home for the next year. The station's gleaming silver rings rotated slowly, maintaining artificial gravity for its 10,000 inhabitants. Tai ran her fingers through her short black hair, a nervous habit she'd developed during her test pilot days. The metal pinned to her chest, the one marking her as Earth's fastest pilot, felt heavier than usual. 3 times she'd broken the atmospheric speed record, and now here she was, about to teach aliens how to fly. The transport docked with a gentle thud. Ta gathered her few belongings and made her way to the airlock, her boots clicking against the metal floor. The station's artificial gravity felt slightly off, just enough to remind her she wasn't on Earth anymore. Commander Han Ta, a tall, blue-skinned alien, waited at the dock. His uniform bore the insignia of the Galactic Defense Force. "I am First Officer Cole. Welcome to Nova 12. Ta nodded, keeping her face neutral despite her fascination with his crystalline eyes. "Thank you, First Officer. I'm ready to meet my squadron. Of course, though I must warn you, they are somewhat concerned about having a human instructor." Cole led her through the station's curved corridors. "Your species is known for taking unnecessary risks. Those unnecessary risks helped us achieve faster-than-light travel 50 years ahead of schedule," Tai replied, remembering the stories of humanity's first FTL test pilots. Half of them had died pushing the boundaries of what was possible. Cole made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Yes, and that is precisely what worries them." They arrived at the training wing, where 12 alien pilots stood in perfect formation. Their heights varied, but all shared the same blue skin and crystal eyes as Cole. Each wore their uniform without a single wrinkle or crease. "Commander Tai," one stepped forward. "I am Wing Leader Pak. We are honored to learn from Earth's finest pilot." Tai studied their faces, noting the barely concealed skepticism in their expressions. "Thank you. I'd like to see your ships first, if possible." The hangar bay took her breath away. 12 fighters sat in precise rows, their silver hulls reflecting the overhead lights. Each ship was at least 2 generations ahead of anything Earth had produced. The smooth lines and advanced materials spoke of technological superiority that made her fingers itch to take control. "Beautiful," she whispered, walking up to the nearest fighter. "What's the thrust-to-weight ratio?" 15-1, Pak answered proudly. "Though we never push them beyond 10-1. It would be unsafe." Tai ran her hand along the ship's hull, feeling the cool metal beneath her fingers. "Unsafe. These birds could handle 20-1 without breaking a sweat." The aliens exchanged worried glances. One of them, younger than the others, spoke up. "But the safety protocols clearly state." "Safety protocols are guidelines, not prison walls," Tai interrupted. She popped open the cockpit and climbed in, settling into the pilot's seat. "Mind if I take her up?" "Now." Pak's crystal eyes widened. "Without studying the manuals first." Ta was already powering up the systems, her fingers dancing across the unfamiliar controls with practiced ease. "Best way to learn is by doing." "Anyone want to fly wing?" The younger pilot who had spoken earlier stepped forward. "I will, Commander. I am Pilot Lin." 10 minutes later, Ta's borrowed fighter shot out of the hangar bay with Lin following close behind. The stars stretched out before them, infinite possibilities in every direction. Ta felt the ship responding to her touches, learning its personality the way she had with every experimental craft she'd ever flown. "Watch this," she said over the comm, then threw the fighter into a series of maneuvers that had Lin gasping. The ship rolled and twisted through space, pushing well beyond the supposed safety limits, but well within its true capabilities. "Commander," Lin's voice crackled with alarm. "The stress indicators are red. But is anything actually breaking?" Tai asked, bringing her ship around in a tight loop that would have torn apart a human fighter. "These ships are amazing. They're just waiting for someone to really fly them. She demonstrated a few more maneuvers before returning to the hangar, where the other pilots waited with a mixture of horror and fascination on their faces. As she climbed out of the cockpit, Ta could see she had their attention at last. That was, Pac seemed to struggle for words. Unorthodox. That was flying. Ta corrected. Real flying, not just following numbers on a screen. These ships want to dance. They're just waiting for partners brave enough to lead. Looking at their faces, Ta could see the challenge ahead of her. These pilots had been trained to fear mistakes, to trust computers over instincts. But she saw something else too, a spark of curiosity, especially in Lin's eyes. Tomorrow, she announced, we start learning how to really fly. It won't be safe, it won't be comfortable, but I promise you this, it will be worth it. As the aliens filed out of the hangar, discussing her demonstration in hushed tones, Ta smiled to herself. She'd been worried about this assignment, about leaving Earth to teach aliens. Now she realized this was exactly where she needed to be. These pilots had the best ships in the galaxy. All they needed was someone to show them how to use them. And if there was one thing humans knew how to do, it was pushing boundaries. Ta took one last look at the fighters before heading to her quarters. Tomorrow would be interesting. She was going to teach these aliens how to stop flying like computers and start flying like pilots. They just didn't know it yet. Ta stood behind the simulator control station, watching 12 perfect formation flights execute 12 perfect landings. Not a single pilot deviated more than a millimeter from their assigned position. Their energy management was flawless, their speed control exact to the decimal point. It was driving her crazy. Excellent work, squad, Wing Leader Pac announced as the pilots emerged from their simulators. 0 errors, 0 deviations, 0 imagination. Ta muttered under her breath. Louder, she said, let's try something different. Combat scenario, 3 against 1. The aliens looked at each other uncertainly. Lin, the young pilot who had flown with her yesterday, stepped forward first. I volunteer, Commander. Good. Pick your 2 wingmen. Ta was already programming the simulator. You'll be defending against me. Lin chose 2 of the more experienced pilots. The 3 of them climbed back into their simulators while Ta took the 4th. As the virtual world formed around her, she smiled. This would be interesting. The scenario loaded. Deep space, a few scattered asteroids providing cover. The aliens' 3 fighters appeared on her radar, moving in textbook defensive formation. Begin, Ta commanded, then immediately threw her virtual fighter into a wild spin that looked like she'd lost control. The aliens maintained their formation, probably assuming she'd made a mistake. She hadn't. Using the spin's momentum, Ta whipped her ship around and dove straight through their formation before they could react. In the real world, such a maneuver would have subjected her to crushing forces, but these ships could handle it. She'd proven that yesterday. Commander that exceeded safety parameters by 300%. Pac's voice came through the comm. Did I destroy my ship? Ta asked, already lining up her next attack run. Well, no, but then the parameters are wrong. She rolled her fighter between 2 of theirs, close enough that their shield bubbles would have touched in real life. All 3 alien ships broke formation, responding exactly as their training dictated. Ta picked them off one by one. The simulation ended 3 minutes later. Ta had destroyed all 3 ships without taking a single hit. She climbed out of the simulator to find the entire squadron staring at her. That was impossible, one of the pilots said. The computer says you pulled 25 geese in that first turn. The ships can handle it, Ta replied. I checked the specifications myself last night. Your engineers built fighters that can withstand 30 geese of stress. Why limit yourselves to 10? Because it is safe, Pac insisted. Because it is proven. Ta walked over to the main display and pulled up the replay. Watch this. Here, when Lin tried to evade. Good textbook move. By the way, he had a perfect shot at my engines, but he didn't take it because the angle wasn't in the manual. The aliens gathered around the screen, watching intently as she pointed out opportunity after opportunity they'd missed. She could see understanding beginning to dawn in some of their eyes. "Again," Lynn said suddenly. "Please, Commander, I want to try again." This time, Ty set up a one-on-one scenario. As soon as it began, she could see Lynn flying differently, still precise, but with more awareness of his ship's true capabilities. He still lost, but he lasted twice as long and even managed to score a glancing hit on her fighter. "Better," Ta said as they exited the simulators. "Much better. You started thinking instead of just following procedures." It felt. Lynn searched for the word. Alive. The ship felt alive. "Exactly." Ta turned to address the whole squadron. "These aren't cargo haulers. They're combat fighters. The best in the galaxy. But right now you're flying them like they're made of glass." She brought up the ship's specifications on the main screen. "Look at these numbers. The thrust vectoring alone gives you options your training never mentioned. The neural interface can handle input speeds far beyond what you're using. These ships want to fight. You just have to let them." "But the protocols," Pack began, "were written by people who never saw what these ships could really do," Ty interrupted. "I've spent my life testing the limits of experimental aircraft. Trust me when I say these fighters are being wasted." She programmed another simulation, this time displaying it on the main screen for everyone to watch. Her virtual fighter danced through an asteroid field, using maneuvers that made the aliens gasp. Every move pushed the ship to its limits, but never beyond them. "That's what these ships can do," she said as the demonstration ended. "That's what you can do, if you're willing to learn." Silence filled the simulator room. Ta could see the conflict on their faces, years of training warring with the evidence before their eyes. Finally, Lynn spoke up again. "Teach us," he said simply. One by one, the other pilots nodded. Even Pack, after a long moment, gave a reluctant nod of agreement. "Good," Ta smiled. "Because I've got something special planned for tomorrow's lesson. We're going to throw out the manual and start learning how to really fight." She dismissed the squadron, watching as they filed out while discussing what they'd seen. Many were gesturing with their hands, mimicking flight maneuvers she'd demonstrated. Seeds of change had been planted. Later, in her quarters, Tay reviewed the day's simulator data. Lynn's improvement after just one session was remarkable. He had natural talent, hidden under layers of overcautious training. The others showed promise too, in their own ways. "Computer," she called out, "show me the squadron's previous combat exercise records." Watching the recordings, she could see why the Galactic Defense Force had requested a human instructor. The aliens' rigid adherence to protocols made them predictable. In a real fight, predictability meant death. But that would change. She'd teach them to fly like humans, with instinct, with passion, with the understanding that sometimes you had to break the rules to stay alive. Tomorrow would be interesting. They'd start with basic combat maneuvers, then gradually work up to the kind of flying that had earned her those speed records back on Earth. These aliens were about to learn that there was more to flying than following a manual. Much more. The first distress call came during the night shift. Ty was in her quarters, reviewing flight data when the station's alarms blared to life. She was running toward the command center before the announcement finished. "Outpost 7-3 is under attack," First Officer Cole reported as she entered. "Unknown vessels, unknown configuration. They're not responding to hails." The tactical display showed 5 red dots swarming around the small outpost. As they watched, 3 defense satellites winked out of existence. "Those were our best automated defenses," Pack said, his crystal eyes reflecting the emergency lights. "Nothing should have been able to destroy them so quickly." Ty studied the attackers' movement patterns. "They're not following any known combat doctrine. Look at those turns. They're flying like." She trailed off, realizing what she was seeing. Princess Taval's gaze was hard, unreadable. She stared at Carter for what seemed like an eternity. He could feel the tension in the air. Finally, she spoke. "This is a dangerous proposal, human," she said, her voice a mix of caution and reluctant admiration. "But perhaps you are right. Maybe trust is the only way forward. You will have our support, but do not mistake this for an act of kindness. We will be watching. If you fail, the consequences will be yours to bear." Carter felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had done it. The Zorathians had agreed. But it wasn't over yet. Now came the truly dangerous part. "We will meet tomorrow," Carter said. "I will make the arrangements. We will go to this planet, and we will settle this once and for all." The meeting broke up, and the delegates began to file out of the room. As Carter turned to leave, Princess Tavelle approached him again. She didn't say anything at first, just studied him with those piercing eyes. Then she spoke, her voice quieter now. "You have courage, Ambassador. That much I will give you. But remember, sometimes courage alone is not enough." Carter nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He wasn't just risking his life. He was risking the future of humanity, and the future of every species represented in this room. "I understand, Princess," he said, his voice steady. "But sometimes, courage is all we have." With that, the two of them parted ways, each with their own thoughts and the fate of the galaxy hanging in the balance. The day of the high-stakes meeting had arrived. The air on the neutral planet, a barren world far from the reach of any empire or swarm, felt thick with tension. A dusty, rocky surface stretched out beneath an eerie, cloudless sky. This planet wasn't much, just a forgotten world at the edge of known space. But today, it was the most important place in the galaxy. This was where everything would be decided. Ambassador James Carter stood at the edge of the landing zone, staring out into the desolate landscape. His heart was pounding. He could hear the distant hum of engines as the Zorathian and Irakathi ships began to descend, each delegation arriving in their own transport vessels. It had been a long journey, and Carter knew this was the moment that could either make or break the peace effort. If this meeting went well, they might avoid war. If it failed, the consequences could be disastrous. Carter wasn't the only one feeling the weight of the moment. His Zorathian counterpart, Princess Tavelle, stood beside him, her icy eyes scanning the horizon. She had been silent for the past few minutes, lost in her own thoughts, but Carter could feel her presence beside him. The Zorathians had agreed to come to this neutral world, but they weren't happy about it. For them, showing any weakness, any vulnerability, was unacceptable, and this was a risky venture. The Irakathi were no less intimidating. Hive Queen Sekthar, their leader, was said to have a presence that could freeze anyone in their tracks. She wasn't here in person yet, but Carter knew she would be arriving soon. The Irakathi had little use for diplomacy, but Carter had convinced them that this meeting would be their best chance to crush the Zorathians without firing a single shot. The Irakathi, driven by their hive mind mentality, saw strategy in everything. The idea of meeting on neutral ground, with no immediate danger, might have appealed to their cunning nature. Just as Carter was about to turn back to the landing zone, the first of the Zorathian transports touched down. The ground rumbled beneath his feet as the massive ship settled into place. Princess Tavelle stood tall, her face as unreadable as ever, her armor gleaming in the harsh light of the planet's sun. She didn't flinch, didn't show any sign of nervousness. She was, as always, composed, regal, and powerful. "We are here, human," Tavelle said, her voice carrying a mixture of expectation and caution. "Now let us see if your so-called trust can stand up to the pressure of this moment." Carter nodded, swallowing hard. The Zorathians weren't just participating in this meeting. They were testing him. If this failed, they would never believe in humanity again. They would never trust any species that lacked the strength and resolve to do things their way. The Irakathi ship arrived moments later, a dark, menacing vessel that seemed to cast a shadow over the planet's surface. Its insectoid shape was unlike anything Carter had seen before, and it landed with a strange buzzing noise that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Carter didn't dare look away from the ship as it settled into place, a reminder of the cold, unfeeling force that the Iraqethi represented. Then the air went silent. No one spoke for a moment, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Finally, the ramp of the Iraqethi ship lowered with a hiss, and out walked Hive Queen Sekthar. Her form was terrifying. The Hive Queen towered over Carter, her insect-like body moving with a smooth, unsettling grace. Her compound eyes glowed a deep red, and her many limbs scuttled across the ground, making an eerie clicking sound with every step. She had the authority of a queen, and there was no doubt in anyone's mind that she was the one in control of the Iraqethi. Carter fought to keep his breathing steady, though he knew that his presence was nothing compared to hers. Tavale didn't flinch, but there was no mistaking the way her eyes narrowed as the Hive Queen approached. These two species had been locked in a deadly struggle for dominance for years. Their history was one of violence, betrayal, and distrust. This meeting was their chance to break that cycle, but it wasn't going to be easy. The two leaders, Tavale and Sekthar, locked eyes. Carter could feel the tension rise in the air. No words had been spoken, but their silent stare was enough to communicate the centuries of animosity between their species. Finally, it was Tavale who broke the silence. "You've arrived," she said, her voice calm but sharp. "Let us see if you truly understand the meaning of diplomacy, Hive Queen." Sekthar didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stepped forward, her many legs making a soft clicking noise as she moved closer to the Zorathian princess. "We understand power," she said, her voice cold and mechanical, like the hum of 1,000 insects. "Power is the only truth we know. Diplomacy is a weak construct, but if it will grant us the advantage, we will play your game. For now." Carter could feel the weight of those words hanging in the air. The Iraqethi had come, but they were here only because they saw it as a way to gain the upper hand. This was a battle of wits and patience. If Carter couldn't convince both sides that peace was possible, the situation would spiral into chaos. The three leaders, Tavale, Sekthar, and Carter, made their way to the large circular table set in the middle of the landing zone. There were no weapons here, no guards, just them and their words. The table was meant to symbolize neutrality, a place where no one had an advantage. Carter took a seat across from both of them, trying to keep his mind focused. He had prepared for this moment his entire life, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the stakes had never been higher. Tavale's eyes remained fixed on Sekthar, while the Hive Queen stared back with her unblinking gaze. Carter knew that the first words exchanged would be the most important. This was where the peace talks would either rise or fall. The silence was deafening. Carter cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "We are here to find a solution to a conflict that has cost many lives," he began, his voice calm but firm. "We cannot afford to let our differences define us. We must find common ground, no matter how difficult." Tavale leaned forward slightly, her piercing gaze never leaving Sekthar. "The Zorathians have given enough, human. We are here to discuss terms, not to be swayed by your words." Sekthar clicked her mandibles, a sound that was both menacing and unsettling. "I do not care for your peace, human," she said. "I care for victory. If peace means victory, then we will consider it. If it means submission, then we will crush you." Carter swallowed hard but didn't let his fear show. He knew the Iraqethi only understood one thing: strength, and the Zorathians respected power too. But Carter had seen how humanity could face impossible odds and still find a way to survive. He believed with all his heart that peace wasn't just a dream. It could be a reality. "You will find no submission here," Carter said, meeting both of their eyes. "This is about survival, not dominance. This is about understanding that war will destroy us all." The room grew even more tense as the words hung in the air. Tavale remained silent, but Carter could see a flicker of something in her eyes. She was listening, and the Iraqethi, though cold and distant, were paying attention. "This is your chance," Carter said, his voice low but urgent. This is your chance to choose a better path. We must work together, or we will all fall." For a moment, there was no response. Then, Tevale spoke, her voice softer now, but still carrying the weight of her people's history. "Perhaps you are right, human," she said, "but we will need to see your strength in action. We will not follow blindly." Carter nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. This was the breakthrough he had been hoping for. They weren't ready to fully trust him yet, but they were willing to listen. And that, in itself, was a victory. The meeting had only just begun, but Carter could already feel a shift in the air. The tension was still there, but for the first time, the possibility of peace seemed a little more real. The meeting had started with hope. There was a crack in the wall of distrust, a small but significant opening, where both the Zorathians and Irakathi were listening. For a brief moment, it felt as though peace was within reach. But Carter knew better than to believe things were truly moving in the right direction. Diplomacy was never as simple as it seemed, especially with species who were built on centuries of hatred. It had been hours since the first words of the meeting, and the talks were growing more intense. Carter had done his best to keep the dialogue moving forward, but every time he thought they might find common ground, the Zorathians or the Irakathi would pull back. They were both stubborn, proud, and unwilling to let go of their positions. Carter sat in the center of the room, his palms sweaty as he listened to the heated debate. Princess Tevale was engaged in a sharp exchange with Hive Queen Sekthar, both leaders refusing to budge. The Zorathians had made their offer, territory for peace, but the Irakathi weren't satisfied. They wanted more. Sekthar's people had always been expansionist, and they viewed anything less than complete domination as a sign of weakness. Carter glanced around the table. There were representatives from other species as well, neutral observers, military officers, and diplomats from smaller factions. Their faces showed the strain of the long discussions, but it was the look in Tevale's eyes that worried him. She was angry, and that wasn't a good sign. The Zorathians had already given more than they ever had before, but it wasn't enough. "We will not give you any more," Tevale snapped, her voice like ice. "You are asking for too much, Hive Queen. Your demands are unreasonable." Sekthar, her insectoid features unmoving, clicked her mandibles in irritation. "Your people are weak, Princess. You offer peace, but it is not a peace that benefits us. You are giving up too little and expecting too much in return. We will not accept this compromise." Carter could feel the temperature rising in the room. This was the breaking point. If things didn't change, the peace talks would collapse, and the galaxy would be plunged into war. Humanity had gambled everything on this moment. Carter's mind raced, but he had no solution to offer. He had done everything he could. The final decision rested with the leaders. But just as he was about to speak up, to offer a new compromise, a sudden noise echoed from the far side of the room. A sharp, mechanical screech filled the air, causing everyone to stop. Carter's heart skipped a beat as he turned, wondering what had just happened. From the shadows of the chamber, a figure stepped forward, a figure he hadn't expected to see. It was one of the Zorathian officers, a man named Dinar, who had been acting as a silent observer for the Zorathian delegation. Dinar had always been a loyal servant to Tevale, or so Carter had believed. But now, as Dinar stepped into the light, Carter saw something different in his eyes. There was no loyalty there, no respect for the peace talks, only cold determination. Dinar had betrayed them. Before anyone could react, Dinar raised a small device in his hand. A button pressed, and in an instant, the room was filled with the sound of the door locking shut with an ominous thud. The lights flickered and went out, leaving everyone in complete darkness. Panic surged through Carter's chest. The chamber was locked. They were trapped. "What is this?" Tevale demanded, her voice filled with fury. "Why have you done this, Dinar?" Dinar's laughter echoed through the darkness, the sound chilling to Carter's bones. "You have no idea how easy it was to manipulate you, Princess. The Arakathi may have been a threat, but the Zorathians were always my true target. You've always been too focused on your honor, your pride. It made you blind. Carter could hear the gasps around him. The other delegates were starting to realize the gravity of the situation. Dinar had planned this all along. He had used the peace talks to get close, to gain trust, and now he had turned on them. Don't listen to him, Tivale said sharply. This is treachery, and you will pay for it, Dinar. But Dinar wasn't listening. He spoke again, his voice growing cold. I have been working with the Arakathi for months, Princess. This meeting was never about peace. It was a trap. And now you've all fallen right into it. Carter's heart pounded in his chest. He had trusted the Zorathians to keep their word, and now one of their own had shattered that trust. Dinar's betrayal was more than just a political maneuver. It was a declaration of war. He had broken the fragile alliance that had been built and placed everyone in jeopardy. But even as the room buzzed with chaos, Carter's mind was working. He needed to think quickly to stop this from escalating further. They couldn't let Dinar and the Arakathi destroy everything. They had to fight back. But how? The darkness seemed to stretch on forever as Carter's thoughts raced. He tried to calm his breathing, but his pulse was rapid, pounding in his ears. He had to keep the situation under control, even in the face of betrayal. From across the room, he heard a low hum, a sound unlike anything he had heard before. It was coming from Dinar. The traitor was activating something. A weapon, a device of some kind. Carter's instincts told him it wasn't just about locking the doors. Dinar had a larger plan in mind. Dinar, what are you doing? Carter called out, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into his chest. This will destroy everything. The galaxy will never forgive you. Dinar didn't respond immediately. Instead, he spoke directly into the comms device he held in his hand. Initiate the countdown, he ordered coldly. A loud beep echoed through the chamber, followed by another voice, a voice that was unmistakably Arakathi. Countdown initiated. Commence Plan Zeta. Carter's stomach dropped. Plan Zeta. What was that? What had Dinar and the Arakathi been planning all along? Before he could react, a sharp hiss filled the room, followed by the sound of doors opening. The lights came back on, blindingly bright, and Carter squinted, trying to adjust. As his vision cleared, he saw what had happened. The Zorathian traitor was not alone. The Arakathi had infiltrated the meeting, and now they were here. Zekthar, the Hive Queen herself, had entered the room, flanked by her soldiers. They were armed, their mandibles clicking ominously. You failed, Princess, Hive Queen Zekthar said with a cold smile. And now your people will pay for it. Tivale's eyes widened with shock and fury. This was your plan all along. You used Dinar to betray us. Zekthar didn't deny it. We knew your pride would lead to your downfall. You were too slow, too proud to see it coming. Now this galaxy will belong to the Arakathi. Carter's heart raced. This was it. The worst-case scenario had come to life. The Arakathi had used the peace talks as a trap, and now they were ready to destroy everything. He had to act fast. He stepped forward, knowing this could be his only chance to stop the Arakathi from gaining the upper hand. You've made a terrible mistake, Hive Queen, Carter said, his voice full of defiance. This is not the way to rule. There will be no peace if you continue down this path. For a brief moment, Zekthar seemed to hesitate, but then she clicked her mandibles, a smile spreading across her insectoid face. You still don't understand, human. There was never any hope of peace, only power. With that, she raised her hand, signaling for her forces to move. The betrayal was complete. But Carter wasn't ready to give up. He knew this was only the beginning. The room was filled with tension. Carter felt the weight of the betrayal crushing down on him like a heavy rock. His mind raced as he tried to process what had just happened. Dinar, the trusted Zorathian officer, had turned on them. The Arakathi had infiltrated the peace talks, and now they were in control. The chances of peace, the fragile hope they had all held onto, seemed to slip further and further away with every passing second. The Hive Queen, Sekthar, stood tall and powerful in the center of the room, flanked by her soldiers. Her cold, calculating eyes locked on Carter, T-Vale, and the other delegates who were still in shock from the sudden turn of events. The air was thick with fear and uncertainty. They had been so close to achieving something incredible, a breakthrough that could end years of war, but now it all seemed like a distant dream. Carter didn't allow himself to show the fear that was creeping up on him. He couldn't. This wasn't the time to panic. He had to think. There was still a way out of this, a way to turn things around. But how? How could they possibly stop the Arakathi now that they had control? He glanced at Princess Tuvale. Her expression was one of anger and betrayal, but there was also something else in her eyes. It was a spark, a glimmer of determination that had not been extinguished by Dinar's treachery. For the first time in the entire meeting, Carter saw that Tuvale was ready to fight. She wouldn't let this betrayal define her or her people, and neither would he. "We're not giving up," Carter muttered to himself, more to gather his own courage than anything else. "We can still do this." Sekthar's voice cut through the room like a knife. "You should have known better, human. You had your chance. Now you'll watch as the Arakathi rise to power." Her words were cold, filled with the confidence of someone who believed they had already won. But Carter wasn't ready to accept defeat. He could feel the eyes of the delegates on him now, waiting for him to do something. They needed a leader, and in this moment, he had to be that leader. Even if it seemed like the odds were stacked against them, he had to hold on to hope. "Peace was always the answer," Carter said, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts swirling in his mind. "And peace can still be the answer. You don't have to destroy everything. You can still make the right choice." Sekthar's eyes narrowed. "And what would you suggest, human? You are in no position to offer peace anymore." "I disagree," Carter said, stepping forward. "The Arakathi may have the upper hand for now, but that doesn't mean you've won. The Zorethians will fight, and humanity will fight too. We'll fight for what we believe in, because we believe peace is possible. We believe that the future can be different." Sekthar was silent for a moment, as though considering his words. But then her mandibles clicked, and her cold smile returned. "You still don't understand, do you? Power doesn't care about beliefs. Power cares only for domination." Tuvale, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "Power may care for domination, Hive Queen, but it is not the only thing that matters. There is something greater than power. There is the future of our people. There is the chance to build something better." Carter nodded, feeling a surge of hope. He wasn't alone in this fight. Tuvale was with him. And she wasn't just going to sit back and let the Arakathi have their way. She had more strength in her than anyone had given her credit for. "You're right," Carter said, his voice stronger now. "We may be outnumbered, and we may be in a difficult position, but we're not giving up. We've come too far. The galaxy is tired of war. It's tired of losing people. We can find a way to stop this, but we have to stand together." Sekthar's eyes flashed with anger. She took a step forward, but Tuvale stepped in front of Carter, her stance strong and unyielding. "You will not push us around, Hive Queen. You may think you have the power, but you don't understand the strength of unity." Carter watched the two leaders face off, their eyes locked in an unspoken challenge. This was the moment, the turning point. If they could hold their ground here, maybe, just maybe, they could turn the tide in their favor. For a moment, there was silence in the room. Even the Arakathi soldiers seemed to hold their breath, waiting for their leader to make the next move. And then, just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, something unexpected happened. A loud crash echoed through the room. The door at the far end of the chamber burst open, and a new figure stepped in, a figure Carter didn't expect to see. It was one of the neutral observers, a diplomat from a smaller faction. But there was something different about him. His eyes were sharp, his demeanor confident, and in his hand he held something that made Carter's heart skip a beat: a weapon. The diplomat raised the weapon high, and a beam of bright energy shot out, striking the ceiling above them. Dust and debris fell, and the lights flickered again, casting the room in a dim, flickering glow. The room erupted in chaos as the Irakathi soldiers scrambled, their attention momentarily distracted. "Now's our chance," Carter whispered to Tuvale. "We can do this." Tuvale gave him a small nod. Without wasting a second, she reached for her own weapon, hidden beneath her cloak. The Zorathian soldiers, who had been quietly observing, now sprang into action, taking up positions around the room. The tide was turning, and the Irakathi were no longer in control. But Sekthar wasn't ready to give up. The Hive Queen's mandibles clicked furiously, and she raised her hand to signal her soldiers. But before she could give the order, the diplomat fired again, this time disabling the communication device that Sekthar had been using to coordinate with the Irakathi forces outside. "Enough," Sekthar hissed, her voice laced with fury. "You will all pay for this. This is not the end. The Irakathi will not be stopped by mere tricks." Carter didn't flinch. He knew this was just the beginning of the battle. But they had created a crack in the Irakathi's armor. And that was enough. It was a turning point. It was a sign that the people who wanted peace, the people who believed in a better future, were not powerless. "Maybe it's not the end," Carter said, stepping forward with more confidence than he had felt in a long time. "But it's a beginning. And we'll see this through. We're not going to let you destroy everything we've worked for." The room buzzed with energy, and the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The diplomats and soldiers who had once stood on the sidelines were now ready to take action. The Irakathi might have thought they had won, but Carter and Tuvale were fighting for something more important than power. They were fighting for the future. And now, with a new plan in motion and a sense of unity stronger than ever, the galaxy was on the brink of change. They had reached a turning point, and Carter knew one thing for sure: the war wasn't over. But the battle for peace had just begun. The chaos in the room had settled into an uneasy calm. The air was thick with the smell of tension, the echoes of battle still ringing in everyone's ears. But for the first time in what felt like forever, the galaxy's fate seemed to rest on a single fragile thread. Carter stood at the edge of the room, his pulse still racing after the firefight that had just unfolded. The Irakathi had been pushed back, their plans interrupted, but the battle was far from over. Princess Tuvale stood at the center of the room, her face a picture of strength. Her usually composed demeanor had been tested in ways she could never have imagined. But now, after all the betrayals, the fear, and the uncertainty, she stood tall as a beacon of hope. Her people had suffered under the weight of war for far too long. She knew this moment could be the beginning of a new era, or the end of everything they had fought for. Her hands gripped the podium before her knuckles white from the pressure. The room had fallen silent, and all eyes were on her. The Zorathian soldiers, the neutral diplomats, and even the remaining Irakathi forces, all waited for her to speak. Carter felt the weight of the moment press down on him as he watched Tuvale. This wasn't just any speech. This was the chance to change everything. Tuvale took a deep breath and began. Her voice, though steady, carried the weight of centuries of struggle and sacrifice. "We have all seen the horrors of war. We have all felt its sting, its pain. Our families, our homes, our futures have been torn apart by the battles we've fought. And yet, we stand here today, not as enemies, but as people who can still change the course of history." Her words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone in the room. Carter could feel the tension start to ease, the harsh words and accusations from moments earlier fading into something more hopeful. The Irakathi soldiers, standing at the back, exchanged glances. They were still waiting for a command. But Tuvale's voice had shifted the energy in the room. The princess was making her case, and even the most hardened among them could not ignore her presence. I stand here today, not just as a leader of the Zorathian people, but as someone who believes in the possibility of peace, Tigal continued. I believe that despite our differences, despite the pain we have all caused one another, we are capable of finding common ground. Carter watched as the princess spoke, her words not just directed at the Irakathi, but at everyone in the room. It wasn't just about politics. It wasn't about power. It was about the future. The princess's speech was an appeal to their humanity, their shared hopes, their dreams of a better life for their people. For centuries, we have fought for territory, for resources, for dominance, but in all this time, we have lost sight of what really matters, the people. Our people. She paused, her voice growing softer. We fight not because we hate each other, but because we are afraid. Afraid of what the future holds, afraid of losing what little we have. But if we continue down this path, we will lose everything. We will destroy each other until there is nothing left. The room was still. Even the Irakathi soldiers seemed to be listening intently now. Tivel's words were powerful, a plea that no one had expected to hear from someone of her rank. Carter felt a small flicker of hope stir in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't too far gone. Peace is not a weakness, Tivel declared, her voice gaining strength with every word. It is not a surrender. Peace is a choice, and I choose it. I choose it for my people, for your people, for all of us who have suffered because of this endless war.